Okay. All right. So, welcome everyone to our November 2024 meeting. I'm Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society of Texas. We do have our name has officially changed. We're just kind of working on changing the logo and stuff so that everything can kind of work together. Which is why you may still see it referred to as the Panhandle Archaeological Society for a while. Um, Tonight, our speaker is Mark D. Mitchell with his presentation, Warfare on the Northern Plains, Quantifying the Construction of Community Fortifications at the Molander site. I said that right, yes?
Yep,
Okay,
Molander.
okay. Before I give the floor to Mark, though, please make sure that your mics are turned off. We just want to be able to minimize interference and make sure that we can hear everybody clearly. Also, you're welcome to keep your cameras on, but if you know that you're going to kind of be like up and down and moving around the whole time, you might want to turn your camera off just to minimize distractions. And with that, I give the floor to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Let me share my screen. And how does that look, Aaron?
It's looking great from my end.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come and chat with you about research that my organization, Paleocultural Research Group, has been working on. We've been working in the region anyway for about 30 years. And so this is long-term research at the Molander site, but also at other sites in the region. And I understand from Scott that there have been a number of events in the Panhandle region uh, that have been recognizing the 150th anniversary of the Red River War. And that, I think, that the conflict epitomized in some ways by the Red River War between the U.S. military and equestrian uh, indigenous societies on the plains. That's what people often think about when they think about warfare on the plains. Uh, and I think that conflict was typical of the 19th century, not only between the military and uh, American Indians, but also among American Indian societies in some ways. But what I want to, excuse me, what I want to do tonight is introduce you to a really different type of conflict, a different mode of warfare that was typical of the Northern Plains for much of the last millennia, starting in the 1000s and continuing into the 19th century. So let's begin tonight by just stipulating that warfare and violence are not the same thing. Those are not synonyms. Warfare it's socially sanctioned. It's planned. It has justifications. It has a social context. And so for that reason, it's of great interest to anthropologists and sociologists as well. But it's a very appropriate topic for uh, social scientific research. Archaeologists, I think, can really contribute to that because of this long record of human experience that we have access to. So it's something that archaeologists can make important contributions to. So what I'm interested in is not the violence of warfare per se, not warfare per se, but the way in which warfare was really integrated into societies and communities, and the way the impacts of warfare were felt on societies and communities, and really how the economic practices and social institutions that grew up around warfare were a part of a particular time and place in the past. So before we delve into that topic, you know what I'm going to do is I am going to reset my timer so I know what's happening. Let's do a little bit of geographical and cultural context first before we get into warfare. So the Northern Plains. The red line on the image here on the map, that's the course of the Missouri from the Three Forks in Montana down to St. Louis. I like this map because it doesn't have the northern border of the U.S. depicted. And I think it's important to think about the plains as not stopping at the 49th parallel. A lot of maps that show the plains do just that. They cut off the northern part, and particularly for the native peoples of North Dakota that we're going to be talking about tonight, a lot of their interactions with the wider world occurred to the north, not as much in some ways to the south. So the part between the section of the river between the arrows here, this is what archaeologists call the Middle Missouri region. The Middle Missouri sub area was the term, good 1950s term for it. That extends from the Yellowstone downriver to down the Missouri to the White River. Some folks would take it almost all the way to Nebraska and the Niobrara, but it's essentially the Missouri Valley in the Dakotas. And the part of it that we're going to be focusing on tonight, right here in this yellow box, which is roughly central North Dakota. So let's zoom in a little bit more and look at a map with some political subdivisions. We can get a little orientation, further orientation. Here, the Missouri, the Middle Missouri, I should say, the Middle Missouri sub area is indicated by the red section of the Missouri, again from the Yellowstone to the White in the Dakotas. And the specific part of it that we're going to look at is in that blue box. And what's in that blue box is the central part of North Dakota. Uh, Really, the section of the river from just above and below the town of Bismarck, the capital of North Dakota, on up to the Knife River and a place that some of you may have visited or know about called the Knife River Indian Villages National Historic Site, which is a Park Service facility, Park Service unit at the mouth of the Knife River. What we're seeing in this map here are a couple of the really key cultural and geographical features of this part of the world. One of them is the Heart River. And the confluence of the Heart River and the Missouri, where Bismarck is today, that is the homeland, the heartland of Mandan settlement. Mandan tribal settlement from the mid 1200s into the mid 1700s. The Knife River to the north, just in the upper left corner of the map here, the confluence of the Knife and the Heart is the traditional home place of the Adadza people who lived there again from the 13 or 1400s on up into the middle of the 19th century. The Molander site, the little triangle in the middle, it's kind of right in the middle between those two larger occupation zones, the Mandans to the south and the Adadzas to the north. So what does this look like? If we could fly over it, it looks like that. This is a view of the Missouri looking downstream from essentially where Molander is. So the Molander site that we're going to be talking about in some depth is off just to the right of this image, just off the view to the right. In the middle distance, there are a series of buttes called the square buttes, and those square buttes, the square buttes, are the traditional geographical division between the zone of Mandan occupation along the river and the zone of Adadza occupation. Excuse me, upriver to the north. So the Molander site, let's look at another aerial view. This is actually an oblique view of Google Earth imagery, so it's a little oddly distorted. Now we're looking to the northeast, no longer downriver, looking kind of upriver, and you can see the plains off in the background to the east, and in the foreground, this sort of squiggly line, that's the Molander site. I'll give you some orientation to that in a couple of minutes. A lot of the imagery I'm going to show you of Molander has another sort of point of reference, which is this railroad line that cuts diagonally through this imagery. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and we'll come around to it at the end, is the Missouri is on the other side of the valley, opposite Molander. And based on our understanding of valley geomorphology and historical maps of the river course, it probably was over there at the time of the occupation of Molander. The river was not next to the settlement, which is, I think, an interesting factor and that'll come into play toward the end of the talk. So let's look at the site more specifically. This actually is not an aerial image of the site. This is a digital elevation model that we created through a series of drone-based images stitched together into a big mosaic. Uh, the fortification ditch is that squiggly line, which we'll talk quite a bit more about. Uh, the, uh, the little light line around the perimeter, that's a fence, and that marks the perimeter of the property that the State Historical Society of North Dakota owns. So in 1930, they purchased the site from a guy named Gustav Molander, hence the site name. And they own just enough property to encompass the site. Probably pretty typical of the 1930s, but a blessing really that North Dakota was uh, uh, thinking ahead, and particularly a guy named George Will, who was the secretary of the State Historical Society. He was thinking ahead enough to make sure that archaeological sites were preserved. So Molander is owned by the state of North Dakota, and it's in pretty good shape. Really, with the exception of this homestead, 1882, quite early actually for the west side of the Missouri in North Dakota. And there's some faint diagonal lines running from lower left to upper right, kind of in the village. It has been plowed inside the ditch, not outside, but inside the ditch, and by these homesteaders. There's metal that relates to that period of time from the homestead scattered around on the surface. But really, the site is in remarkably good condition, even despite that. All right, so who lived at Molander and when was it occupied? Well, by far the best evidence we have for that comes from Lewis and Clark. And this is a sheet of Clark's map of the Missouri relevant to this region. I've turned it on its side so that up is actually north, more or less, in this imagery. The original map is rotated clockwise, so you can see the writing goes the other way. The Knife River confluence is kind of left center, and then and the river's flowing downstream to the right. Clark provided a couple of good landmarks, one of which is this thing called Fort Mandan, this sort of odd triangular structure. That was the winter quarters of the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark's expedition, 1804, 1805. Right in the river valley, on the floodplain of the Missouri, it's no longer extant. That's where they spent the winter. And they spent the winter in the company of the Mandans and Adatsas, what they called the five villages at the confluence of the Knife and the Missouri. So those five little sort of dotted circles are five villages where the Mandans and Adatsas lived. The two on the right are where Mandan people lived at the turn of the 19th century, and the three on the left along the Knife River are where Adadza people lived. That puts us in the vicinity culturally and geographically, and we know that this little dotted circle down here is the Molander site. A Sanish or Arikara diplomat who was accompanying Lewis and Clark told them that this was the place where the Alhawi band of the Adatsas lived. Our work, our archaeological work at the site absolutely confirms that. Temporally, culturally, there's a great uh, data set that shows that this spot on Clark's map is in fact the Molander site. So, to summarize about the village, it was one of the three divisions of the Adatsas, the Alhawi division. This is like a sub-tribe of the Adatsa people, lived there. They were recent arrivals to the Missouri. They came around 1600. Previously had lived in eastern North Dakota. And we know that Molander, based on a whole bunch of data, archaeological data as well as historical and historical cartographic data, that it was occupied during the middle of the 18th century. Some probably founded about 1735, almost certainly no longer occupied in 1765. covers about 5 acres, 5.2 acres. And that area was enough to house, say, 400 to 450 people as an estimate. So now we know when and who, and we want to focus a little bit more on the nature of these settlements. And the the Adadzes and the Mandans were societies that followed what archaeologists call the Plains village pattern. So they were Plains village societies. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means and kind of paint a picture for you what these settlements were like. Um, Plains village peoples occupied the plains from Texas to North Dakota and from eastern Nebraska to Kansas City. Not everybody who lived on the plains was a Plains village person, or not every community was a Plains village community, but Plains village communities existed all over the plains. We can think of them as folks who followed a mixed hunting and harvesting economy. I'm going to run through these and then dive into them a little bit more. A mixed hunting and harvesting economy. They built timber frame houses, big timber frame buildings. All their settlements are located adjacent to quality agricultural land. They made extensive use of storage facilities and distinctive bone and stone tools and pottery. I'm not going to talk too much about artifacts. Let's think about those first 4 points. Uh, Archaeologists, this is sort of a comical debate, but there is a bit of a debate as to whether we should think of Plains Village peoples as maize farming bison hunters or bison hunting maize farmers. The truth is, it doesn't matter because those two resources are super abundant, super high value, super high yield, and so they were relying on not just one primary food source, but two really abundant, really productive uh, sources of subsistence that they could integrate in different ways depending on climate and the economic conditions of the time and so on. So they had a very flexible basic subsistence economy, but they added a lot to that. So on the left here is one of Edward Curtis's photographs of folks gathering buffalo berries. Wild fruits are really common in these sites: plums, grapes, choke cherries, currants, buffalo berries, lots of wild grass, seeds, fish from the river. The picture on the right is a fish weir on the Missouri. There's also fish hooks, so they're taking fish in a lot of different ways, and shellfish. And we can add deer and upland game birds and a whole variety of subsistence goods that made their system extremely flexible, extremely productive, and very dynamic. Architecture. They built these timber frame buildings. They're called earth lodges, but in fact, it's better to think of them as timber frame buildings. The earth is just the final covering. There's a whole series of materials that cover these things. This is one of Edward Curtis's photographs of a 20th century, early 20th century earth lodge, which he ascribes to the Mandans. These are big buildings. We estimate that somewhere between 5 and 15 people lived in them uh, during the historic period. And amazingly, we actually know within some detail, what the interior of these things looked like. This is a drawing by a fellow named Carl Bodmer, who visited that region of the five villages in 1833 and 34 with a German guy named Prince Maximilian. Uh, Bodmer was a good artist, and he had great access during the course of an entire winter to these settlements. Lots of great portraits, but this interior of an earth lodge shows something about the scale. To give you an idea, if you look on the left-hand side, the good ponies, the good horses, they lived inside during the winter, North Dakota winter. So you have horses in there, you got dogs, you got all kinds of equipment, you got pottery and weapons and shields and Folks sitting around the fire, chewing the fat, doing all sorts of things. Again, 10 or 12 folks in these buildings, big structures. And the settlements are really closely packed. Here's another image of one of these settlements. This again this is the Mandan village at Fort Clark, drawn by a guy named George Catlin that also was down in your neck of the woods quite a bit and drew a lot of images of Comanche people in the Southern Plains. Um, and this is the same village that Bodmer worked at. This just shows you some of the exterior of what these settlements might have looked like. Catlin was clearly not the artist that Bodmer was, but it shows you how packed they were, how many people were there. This is something called the last race, which is one of the 4 days of the Okipa ceremonies. Uh, Basically a world creation reconstruction ceremony, similar to the Sundance. Um, so it shows you how densely settled these places were. And finally, villages close to arable land. The dots on this map, this is the stretch of the river right around Bismarck. So the southern part, you can see where the Heart River comes in, and Apple Creek from the east side of the river. That's where Bismarck is today. And every one of those dots is a Mandan settlement occupied um, between about 1500 and 1750. Lots of them. Many of those are simultaneously or concurrently occupied. And they're all essentially big settlements with large domestic architecture housing a lot of people. So very high settlement density during that period. And I guess the actual final point regarding Plains Village people is storage. Lots and lots of storage. Well, they could store a lot because they had this incredibly productive and flexible subsistence or economic system. This particular University of Missouri field school student, she's crouching. She's not standing up, but you can see how big these are. This is a bell-shaped pit in one of these settlements, Mandan settlement called Double Ditch Village near Bismarck. The settlement has thousands of these pits like this all throughout the settlement. Not all used at the same time, of course. But these are essentially maize storage. They're underground silos, and so these guys had they had access to a really um, strong and resilient economic system. So, what's the bottom line about Plains Village Society? Certainly on the northern plains, these guys were wealthy. They had a lot of power. They were the big dogs on the block. Folks came to them to trade. The trade system revolved around all these settlements on the Missouri, um, particularly in before the 1780s. That was really the case. These guys were in control of the region. They had the resources and wealth to do what they will. Uh, they also had a lot to lose, which brings us back to warfare. You guys have probably seen this image. As I understand it, this is a Kiowa. It is a Kiowa ledger drawing, but I believe it's believed to be an image of a conflict during the Red River War called the Battle of the Buffalo Wallow or Battle of Buffalo Wallow. The question we want to turn to now is how do we know about warfare in the past? Well, for the 19th century, we have a tremendous historical record. Obviously, narratives written by soldiers. We also have a great indigenous historical record of warfare in the 19th century. Uh, Ledger drawings and biographic art generally, it it it's extremely detailed and it is an historical record. Depicted here are actual individuals doing things that they actually did during this battle, and events that happened. And so it is a way of recording a narrative of this conflict. We know, though, that biographic style extends much farther back in time. And so we have a whole rock art record that reflects that type of warfare, the type of warfare that we think of as common during the 19th century. Uh, we have a record of that extending much further back in time. So we have pretty good understanding of patterns of warfare, modes of warfare for the 19th century and the late 18th century. How about before that? How about archaeological, uh, sort of dirt archaeological evidence of warfare? Well, there's a whole list of things. This is not exhaustive. There's other things, but people often talk about site placement as being indicative of a defensive position. Of course, that can be equivocal, right? There's a number of reasons to put a site up on a high isolated location. Warfare, perhaps one of them, but one can think of some other reasons. Uh, Villages get burned down during conflicts, during warfare, and that may be an indicator of 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 conflict. But villages also burn for other reasons as well, so it's not an exclusive indicator of war. Uh, some there certainly are good examples of human remains that exhibit evidence of violence. Um, some of that may be from warfare, some of it's from other causes. We do have some evidence, for example, from a site called Crow Creek in South Dakota, central South Dakota on the Missouri, where it appears that everyone in a settlement of up to 500 people was killed during a conflict. Surely that's indicative of warfare, but not all evidence of trauma on human remains is. That brings us to fortifications. Fortifications are sort of in a different class here. They are uh, an indirect indicator of warfare because they reflect people's anticipation of conflict. You got to build them before you need them. You can't build them after the folks are at your doorstep, right? Because they take a lot of planning, as you'll see, and a lot of organization and effort to construct. So they're anticipatory, and they're really the design of them, in my opinion, is it reflects people's judgment of risk. So let's look at the Molander fortification and kind of break it down into pieces and talk a little bit about what it looked like. So we have the exterior ditch, straight sections of the wall. And I don't have a picture of what it looked like at the time, but interestingly, we can actually look at, in this case, a picture of a Roman fortification. Uh, and you may be thinking, Roman fortification? What the heck? What does that have to do with anything? I think it's important to remember that these are engineering problems that people solve over and over again and have around the world. And the basic problem of defending a fixed settlement from attack is one that's been solved multiple times in the same way. And so we can look at a whole bunch of examples from the medieval world, from the ancient world, that show the characteristics of fortifications that are essentially identical to what we see at Molander. So again, this is a Roman illustration, but you have an exterior ditch. That's one on here. Uh, Here number two, they've placed these branches and so forth on the interior slope of the ditch. And some sites in the middle Missouri have such things incorporated into them. Uh, the Roman version at 5 has planks. On the wall, we have pretty good historical evidence that in the case of Molander, green hides were used rather than planks. The only real difference here is that number 4, which is a rampart, that didn't exist uh, at Molander. There's no interior platform. There was just the wall, the hide-covered wall. But another element of the fortification, it incorporates something called bastions. Many of you may know what these are. Each one of those little, I think there's 8 little projections or bumps on the exterior is a bastion. And again, we can turn to this is a schematic of a medieval fortress, but these are bastions. And the purpose of the bastion is to allow defenders to defend the base of the wall. If you didn't have them, the way to defeat the fortification would be to run up to the wall and try and hack a hole in it or set it on fire. And if there's no bastion, the defenders can't shoot directly down below themselves, and so they really can't defend the wall. So if you can make it to the wall, of course it's difficult to do so, but if you can make it to the wall, you can breach it. So bastions prevent that. Again, it's an engineering solution that has been invented over and over around the world. And in fact, there's a whole long record of bastion fortifications, just like Molanders, in the same Heart River region. So here's a site from the early 1200s. Straight walls and bastions. So the dotted line is the ditch around the fortification. Here's one from the mid 1400s. A huge, very carefully engineered site. Bastions, spaced at appropriate intervals on the corners and on the curtain walls, built up against the Missouri on the fourth side. Here's another example, a long-lived site called the Double Ditch Village near Bismarck, occupied for nearly 300 years. Here you have a whole series of fortifications that contracted over time as the settlement got smaller. You see that exterior green area with the blue line. There's a fortification loaded with bastions. And then over time, the village got smaller and they rebuilt the fortification repeatedly so that it more closely fit the size of the settlement. So long history of this exact kind of fortification. All right, so let's put a little human scale on our fortification at Molander. On the upper right here, a couple of University of Oklahoma, or excuse me, Oklahoma State University uh, students who are sitting in the fortification ditch at Molander. Shows you a little bit about what the size is. We know that it's about half full of sediment right now. On the lower left is a fellow named Jeremy Menzer, a grad student at University of Arkansas, doing a magnetic gradiometer survey of the village. Uh, there's a bastion right in the foreground. He's walking through the ditch just past the bastion. That gives you a sense of what it looks like on the ground today. If you excavate one of these, that's what they look like. This particular one is at Double Ditch Village. This is Ditch 3 at Double Ditch Village. That's Ann Johnson, an archaeologist from Montana, standing in the bottom of the ditch. Behind her, you can see the post line where the wooden palisade would have been built. If we compare Molander to some other settlements, uh, we see that the fortification's big, but it's not crazy big. So this box and whisker plot is showing you the average depth on the left and the width of the top of the ditch on the right for 14 different fortifications. And the Molander figures are there. The thing is about 1.40 meters deep toward the upper end, but not beyond the upper range of other ditches in the region. This is the Heart River region, and 3.5 meters wide at the top. Again, big, but not outside the range of other fortifications that we have some good data for. So if we want to think a little bit about, or where I want to go with this, is I want to talk about something that folks call architectural energetics. We want to know how much labor effort is required to put this thing together. How much effort do people have to go to build this thing? And we want to do that by first calculating sort of the volume of material you got to dig up to create a ditch, and then how many people that might require. So let's break the ditch or break the fortification down into a couple of pieces to do that. First is a section of the fortification called the cut terrace. So on the north side, where that sort of green coulee is, it's a very steep embankment, and a ditch is not required there. But nevertheless, the fortification was built along the top of the coulee, and what they did is just make a bench essentially on the top slope of that coulee. So they had to cut away some sediment to make a flat surface to set the palisade posts. So this gives you a sense of the cross section, the original cross section in the dashed line, and then the black line shows the cross section that they created by cutting out that bench. And this cut terrace feature uh, is something that we see at other sites. This is called Chief Lookings Village. You've got, and it's on a bluff or a narrow peninsula, and on the narrow ends you have a ditch with bastions on the right, but then you have these cut terrace features on the steep slopes on the top and bottom, or north and south sides. So this is again another feature. Chief Lookings Village dates to the mid 1500s. So this is another feature that has a long history as an engineering solution in the region. So how big is this thing? All right, all these dimensions are in meters. Uh, our digital elevation model, we can measure directly from that, and we see that the ditch itself, including all the bastions, is 440 meters long going around. And again, it's 3.5 meters wide at the top. It's about a meter wide at the bottom, little less. So it's sort of V-shaped or trapezoidal shaped. And again, it's about a meter 40 deep. That cut terrace I was just mentioning, it's 152 meters long, 4 meters wide, and on average about 30 centimeters deep, if you will. Uh, the ditch doesn't work unless you have a palisade. That's a key part. And so we understand from other settlements in the region where we have excavation data that the palisade was generally about 4.5 meters back from the center line of the ditch. So if we look at the length of that setback all the way around, we needed about 574 meters of palisade logs to build that fortification. So let's translate that from some lengths into some things we can use to calculate work effort. The volume of the ditch is about 1,300, 1,400 cubic meters of material. Um, the volume of that terrace is about 270 cubic meters. Th these are big piles of dirt, but not insufferable, or not impossibly large. To go around that 574 meters of palisade, you need almost 1,800 posts, 1,800 trees. We know from historical records that that the palisade was 12 to 15 feet high. So you need full-size trees for each one of those posts. Uh, the archaeological data uh, tells us that the posts are not set uh, immediately adjacent to one another. There's about 3 posts per meter. So there were significant gaps. That wouldn't have worked functionally, but we know from an historical account that dates to 1738 that the posts were a framework for uh, hanging dry hides. So the hides themselves would have been the curtain wall. In that Roman example, it was wood planks. In our example here for the Heart River region, for the Missouri River Valley, we think that dry hides, bison hides, were the covering. All right, so what kind of work effort is required to do that amount of work? Well, this is a difficult calculation to make. There's a whole bunch of different sources of information about how much people can dig in a day. One of the most often cited sources said that folks using a digging stick can excavate 2.6 cubic meters a day. Um, I'm 62 years old. I do not believe I could do that. And I don't, I have real questions about whether anybody can really do that, except under perhaps the most favorable soil conditions. And we'll see in a moment that Molander does not present the most favorable soil conditions. So based on a number of considerations, I elected to use a figure of 1.5 cubic meters of excavation per person per day. It's about 1,000 person days to do all the digging. If we want to install posts and we got 2-person teams, which It's probably possible. If they could do 10 posts a day, it would be another 350 person days. So we need about 1,500 person days to build the thing, just to dig the ditch and put up the posts. It actually doesn't include hanging the hides, doesn't include a number of other accessory things that we'll talk about in a minute. But that's going to be our base value. Now, before we can understand exactly what that means, we need one more piece of information. Do we think that it was all built at once, maybe before the settlement was occupied, i.e., maybe it was the first thing that people built? They went there, they built it, it was done, then they moved in. Or, reasonable alternative, it was built over time. Maybe they already lived there. Their threat risk assessment of the region changed, and they decided to add it over time, maybe incrementally. So built quickly at the beginning, or as another alternative, built slowly over time, and presumably you could have other alternatives. So we need to be able to address that question before we can understand what our 1,500 person day of work effort really means for the community. So let's do that. To figure that out, we put a trench, a series of excavation units across the ditch at this location on the south side. And this is a view of a part of that. This is a photograph, not a terribly good one, looking into the ditch. That cobbly, bouldery, rocky slope is the original ditch, the original side of the ditch. So the photographer here is standing essentially in the ditch center line and shooting a photograph down into the ditch. So that gives you some sense of how much fill is in there. The bottom of that excavation unit is the original bottom of the ditch, approximately. Um, that slope is all rocky because Molander is built on till, on glacial till. And so there's an upper, 75 centimeters to a meter of loess, of fine grain wind-blown sediment, sitting on top of very bouldery, rocky, clayey, glacial till deposited by, the Wisconsin and glaciers in this part of the world. And that material is extremely difficult to dig through. All the rocks are interlocking and they're all full of clay, and you have to pry the stones out. They're not just sitting there. And all the way around the perimeter of the ditch, they had to, about half the ditch dug through that. Only the upper part was fine grained. Uh, we can look at an exaggerated vertical cross section. So the dip in the black line at 225 north, that's the central axis of the ditch. The spoil, the material dug out from the ditch, is, in this case, it's outside the settlement. And you can see a photograph of what that spoil looks like. It's terrible material to have to dig. But we discovered in doing this work that the spoil, the material from the bottom of the ditch, the till, is sitting directly on soil that formed before the village was founded. I'm going to put my cursor over here. That right there, that dark sediment band beneath the spoil, that's the A horizon of the pre-village settlement, the pre-village surface, excuse me. There's no archaeology on that. And so we know pretty conclusively that the ditch was built first, because the spoil from the bottom of the ditch is not on village deposits. There's no archaeology underneath it. It is on the native prairie. So they came and built the ditch first. This just gives you a little sense of what that looks like in context. Uh, the the pre-village soil down below, the till on top, and then the folks are all in the ditch or on the inside of the village. There's a bastion in the background right here, in the upper left of that image. Okay, so I think without question, the fortification was the first thing built at the settlement. As I said, the lower ditch fill is deposited directly on a surface that doesn't have any archaeology on it. Uh, the upper ditch fill, the stuff that they dug out first, it was right, it's above the till originally. It's not there, it's not in the spoil pile. We think maybe it was stockpiled to use as covering for earth lodges. So ditch built first, then you got to build these big timber frame buildings, again requiring more wood. That bit of information, and given the scale of the fortification and the careful engineering that it represents, that bit of information tells us that this thing was done probably pretty quickly, all at one time. So what does it mean for our Alhawi Idanza society? Well, this was no mean feat. If we had a 45-person crew, that's a tenth of the entire community. And of course, the entire community includes grandma and children and uh, able and unable bodied adults. Uh, you could probably argue about whether more than a tenth of the community could be spared. But remember, they're living somewhere else while they're doing this, so they have to maintain that place as well. That 45-person crew, it'd take them, decent chunk of a summer. 60-day growing season in North Dakota, pretty good chunk of the growing season, uh, to just do the part I was talking about. That doesn't include stockpiling timber, right? Those 1,800 trees, you had to get those ahead of time, presumably, or you had to have a whole bunch of people cutting and hauling timber, again, in an area where there's not a lot of timber. You had to stockpile the hides that you need to cover it with. You had to support those 45 people somehow. Probably had to protect them, but at least you had to feed them, and do the things that they otherwise would have done for their community had they not been involved in construction. And you had to, before you could do any of that, you had to select a site location and figure the layout, design, that is, engineer the fortification, figure out how much space you needed to enclose. You needed enough for everybody, but you didn't want to make the work harder than it had to be, so you didn't want to make it bigger than it needed to be. There's a lot of pre-planning, a lot of leadership required to make that happen. And as a result, I think a good case can be made that warfare and the anticipation of warfare in this part of the world uh, had a really important effect on the way communities were organized, the extent to which leaders were necessary, and the power that leaders had to levy that amount of labor, to get everybody going the right direction to pick up and move to another location. It's interesting to me that that location was selected and utilized despite the incredible difficulty of digging there. And we can see in all our other excavations there that every single storage pit that they were trying to dig came into the till. It intruded into the till, and they had to pry the rocks out of the till, or the till just stopped their construction of a storage pit, and they needed to build more to have the same kind of storage volume. The ditch had the same effect. Every time they tried to put in a fence or a post of any kind, a rack, any kind of thing like that, they would encounter the till. And so it's not a very hospitable place to build a settlement. And yet that was their choice, and they apparently stuck with it. You may remember that I mentioned that the river was not nearby. And I think we have pretty good evidence of that. Uh, Again, that was the spot that was deemed to be the right spot, despite the hurdles of living there. I will leave it at that, But I will mention a couple of other resources that if you just want to know more about Plains Village archaeology, you can check out a couple of really great books on the subject. One of them called Plains Village Archaeology, um, edited by a guy named Stan Ayler, who is the founder of Paleocultural Research Group and former faculty at University of Arkansas, a guy named Marv Kay. Another book by Ray Wood, older but still a classic, and covers the whole plains from Texas north. If you just can't get enough, you can also check out a book by this guy that's all about the archaeology of the area I've been talking about, and particularly about craft specialization among potters and stoneworkers during the 1500s and 1600s primarily. If you want to know more about Plains warfare, there's a real recent book that has all kinds of great contributions, edited by a guy named Doug Bamforth, who was my dissertation supervisor is at University of Colorado, and Andrew Clark, who's now the director of the Archaeology and Historic Preservation Division at the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Has a lot of interesting articles about, or interesting chapters about rock art and the sociality of warfare and so forth. If you want to know more about Molander and about the work of my organization, you can get us on the web at paleocultural.org. And with that, I'll take any questions you may have. And let me stop sharing my screen.
So it looks like we've already got a question from Scott in the chat. It says, how did fortification construction impact horticultural activities? Assuming they built it during the summer before the ground was frozen, how did they protect people working in gardens farther from the village?
Uh, Outstanding questions and ones that I don't necessarily, I don't know that I have great answers to, but I think that's part of the calculation we have to make. You know, the construction of the fortification, it was an all hands on deck operation, right? You had to support the people who were doing it. You had to probably stockpile a lot of resources, maybe for years ahead of time. So the move may have been many years in the making. You know, you needed to have, you know, despite the fact that you have this amazing economic system that was very flexible and produced a lot of surplus, you know, you probably needed a double surplus that year to make sure that it was going to work, that you could make it happen the way you wanted it to happen. Uh, they wouldn't have built the fortification if they didn't think it was a dangerous neighborhood. It clearly was. Whether or not it was actually attacked is a question we can't answer. And in fact, having the fortification may have been a form of détente that discouraged people from attacking. But clearly, it was a dangerous place to live, and they had a lot to lose. So you had to protect folks who were farming. You had to you had to supplant the labor that was lost in construction. And to me, that 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 raises the possibility of inter-community cooperation and perhaps a political arrangement that incorporated multiple communities. Right? They're not maybe they're not just levying labor from one community. They're relying on a confederacy of communities, a group of communities, and that's certainly not unprecedented. Maybe among the Caddo, among the Iroquois, other groups, you know, other native farming groups of the period.
Okay, we have another. Oh, are you reading it, Mark?
Yeah, I can
Okay.
see. Yes, there. Let's see. Yes. So you're absolutely right. It is a fence. That's the property boundary for the State Historical Society of North Dakota. It's all surrounded by private land, uh, and it should be protecting uh, the site from livestock. Uh, the fence gets knocked over pretty regularly. Um, It certainly the last your last question, was the site recognized as an important fortification for a long time? Absolutely, it was well known. In fact, the first map of the settlement was made by a guy named T.H. Lewis in 1883. And he worked for something called the Northwest Archaeological Survey out of Minnesota, sort of a privately funded archaeological research organization. He was a surveyor by trade, but he visited the site in 1883, recognizing its importance. So it's been known for a long time. Uh, the livestock, the intent is to keep the livestock out. Doesn't always work, as you know. Livestock will sometimes do what they want to do. And we had a number of kind of entertaining and not quite so entertaining encounters with bulls, which are pastured around the site. Every time I've been there, they have bulls in the pasture around the site, and so we've had a lot of sort of interesting interactions with those guys. But yes, the answer is it is a fence to protect the archaeology. I see the question from Scott, were they worried about being attacked by mobile hunter-gatherers or someone else? Uh, this type of fortification, it almost certainly reflects siege warfare. Uh, and in fact, we have historical accounts of siege. This is sort of medieval, right? But again, this is the style of warfare, which was large infantry formations involving a lot of people, hundreds of people or thousands of people, at least in the historical accounts that we have from the late 18th century. Uh, I think so. So we don't know the answer of who the attackers are, but the logistical requirements of getting a big enough military force together to conduct a siege on a big settlement like this, to me, suggests that it's other farmers, it's other Plains Village people that have the wherewithal to do that. Uh, that's a question that people have batted around a lot, and we really don't have a good answer to it, and I wouldn't want to give you the impression that we did. But to my mind, the attackers have to be at least as organized and as economically powerful as the defenders. We do know, though, that in the 19th century and in the late 18th century, these places were ports of trade, and folks from all over the plains came, including mobile people on horseback. And some of those groups were big and well organized, and so the Blackfeet came down. The Crow, who were related to the Adazes, came over. Lots and lots of equestrian peoples in the 19th century came to these settlements really to tap into the fur trade because fur traders were coming there. There may be a variety of answers to that question.
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank you so much, Mark, for being our speaker